Thank you for joining the Pacific Council today. As a note to our audience, you are welcome to submit your questions at any time through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or you can click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen to pose your questions directly to Ms. Manuel. And now introducing our Senior Events Officer, Alex Moore.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Pacific Council in today's installment of the Edgerton Series on responding to a rising China. Special thanks to the Edgerton family for making this event and others like it a reality. Today, we're joined by an incredible expert, Anja Manuel. Anja is a former diplomat, an author, and an advisor on emerging markets. She is co-founder and principal of Rice, Hadley Gates, and Manuel LLC, and we're lucky to have her with us. Anja, welcome.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Yeah, Anja, you're a longtime China watcher, and I know our audience is eager to hear your take on the future of U.S.-Chinese relations, particularly given the changed administration about to take place. Now, we could spend the entire hour on this topic, but instead I'm going to ask be open by having you describe how you're feeling about the future of our relationship with the PRC in a single word. For me, that word is nervous, and I know that for many in I know from that many in our audience, that's the case for them as well. So how are you feeling?
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go. Trepidatious and cautiously optimistic. And I'll give you an explanation for the two.
Please do.
U.S.-China relations are now in a tailspin since COVID. They've dropped off a cliff. And this isn't just President Trump being, as people argued 4 years ago, unreasonable about trade. China has changed a lot in the past 4 years. Xi Jinping is really feeling his oats, especially since China came out of the COVID crisis much more rapidly than Europe and the US. We're still deep in the throes of it. Their economy is roaring. And when you talk to Chinese senior officials, the echoes you hear over and over again is the US is in decline. This is our moment. And that has created some very dangerous behavior, I would argue, on the part of Xi Jinping. The national security law implemented in Hong Kong last summer was outrageous. You saw more people arrested these past few weeks. It's really one China, two systems is over in that respect. What's happening in Xinjiang is also outrageous. There have been increasingly a big push by China into the South China Sea, which is obviously contested, over the high Himalayas into India. And so they've really managed to antagonize the world. And so what makes me cautiously optimistic is that the folks who are going in to do this policy in the Biden administration, from Tony Blinken, Secretary of State nominee, to Jake Sullivan at the NSC, to Kurt Campbell, who's just been announced at running all of Asia policy and coordinating it for the United States government. These are all people who know a lot about China, who are thoughtful and moderate, and are already thinking very carefully about what we can do to tone down the aggressive rhetoric, move forward on some things together, and manage our policy differences.
Great. And you kind of created the perfect segue for my next question, which is that President-elect Biden has, for the most part, assembled his foreign policy and national security team, many of which you just named, especially the big players. So what does its composition suggest to you about the administration's likely approach towards China? And it sounds like you're feeling optimistic about the tact they're going to take. So we'd love to hear why.
Yeah, I'm feeling very optimistic about the Biden team that's working on China. I mean, I already mentioned Tony, Jake, and Kurt. I know them quite well because I run this thing called the Aspen Strategy Group and Security Forum. A lot of these folks are in that. They are moderate Democrats, very thoughtful, will be, I think, quite careful. I have a feeling they're going to look in the beginning for a few small things that the US and China could do together to just tone down the rhetoric, right? So many outrageous things have happened just in the past year. The Fulbright program was canceled by both sides. It's been much harder for Chinese students and researchers to get visas to the United States? Could you do something reciprocally there to say, okay, you give our researchers and students real access in China, and we'll think more carefully about that? Can you readmit each other's journalists? Can you reopen the 2 consulates that were closed rather precipitously in the past year? So there are a lot of things you can do, and that I think the Biden administration will want to do to start calming things down. However, no matter how good and professional these folks are, the big structural issues and the complications in the relationship will continue.
And you kind of mentioned that there's lots that we could do, right? So do you think the Chinese are going to be willing to kind of restart a lot of these programs, readmit U.S. journalists? I think if I was sitting in China and I had the United States kind of rebuke me in a number of ways, I'm not sure I'd be so willing to welcomely restart a number of these programs, even if I did welcome the change in rhetoric.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it remains to be seen. I have been part of a few track 2 dialogues with senior Chinese. Now, these aren't people in the government, but they're close to the government. And there seems to be at least an interest in hearing about more positive dialogue. Once you start digging into the details, will China under Xi Jinping actually make any real concessions, either in the tiny things that I just mentioned or in the big things that we care about? There really is still no real market access for American firms. There are human rights violations. There are all these things in the military sphere. I think you very quickly get from conversation about cooperation, which is good, and calming things down, to a relationship that is fundamentally competitive rather than cooperative.
And I'd be kind of curious to hear, and I suspect the audience would be as well, in these conversations you're having, this kind of track 2 diplomacy that you touched upon, are you sensing that the Chinese are perceiving many of the grievances that occurred under Trump and many of the grievances that they have? Is your sense that they're going to kind of hold many of those against the Biden administration, or does this feel like a clean break for them?
Yeah, I think initially, the first 2 years of the Trump administration, the Chinese were inclined to think, this is just President Trump and we'll wait him out and things will then go back to what they were in 2016. But as I said in answer to your first question, China has changed so much that there's no way we can go back to 2016. The Chinese are just far more aggressive than they were then. And China has become far more powerful. Its economy is number 1 in the world if you count by purchasing power parity, not yet in absolute terms. They're the largest trading partner, I think, now with 65 countries around the world. I don't think anyone thinks you're going to have a Cold War and put China back in the box, but there needs to be a conversation that includes not just the US, but the US and our friends and allies, both in Europe and in Asia, about how to appropriately manage the rise of China. And I think Xi Jinping's China has been very adept at trying to cast this as, well, it's the crazy Trump administration against China. And I think they're about to find out that actually the whole world much of the world is concerned about some of the recent actions that China has taken.
Yeah, I agree. Well put. In preparation for today, I listened to a podcast you did with the National Committee on U.S. China Relations back in May. For everyone listening, I highly recommend you listen to it. Very insightful content, and he does a wonderful job, which is unsurprising. In it, you described the U.S. posture on China as primarily defensive and advocated that we take a more offensive path forward. Would you take a moment to explain why you would characterize our approach to date as having been defensive?
Yeah, let me explain that, because what I do not mean is that we should be aggressive with China or do anything in the military sense. What I was talking about there was specifically the technology decoupling between the US and China. So our tech, I live here in Silicon Valley, our tech sectors between the US and China used to be extremely intertwined. In the last 3 years, a lot of that has changed, and really rapidly. And it changed. And what I mean by defensive is, I think the Trump administration appropriately woke up to the idea that we can't be dependent on China for some of the most important tech, and that we need to make sure we're competitive. And I'll say a bit about what those are. In my view, I think the Trump administration took a broader view. That's semiconductors, which is the building block for everything.
Absolutely.
It's 5G, which everyone has already talked about, but then it's also 6G, because it's going to run not just all of the devices in our pockets, but it'll run the Internet of Things.
Right.
You can't have one company.
Not just people, but everything around us, right?
Everything around us, exactly. It's artificial intelligence, which is obviously extremely broad. Certain aspects, not all, of biotech, and then quantum, which is farther out. So I would prescribe the problem a little bit more narrowly than the Trump administration has done. And what I was saying by defensive is the Trump administration did a lot to try to keep American tech in and Chinese investment in tech out.
Right.
That's a really basic way of saying it. Your audience is really sophisticated. We reformed CFIUS, which is foreign investment in the United States. That was long overdue. Some parts of it are maybe a little bit overbroad, but by and large, a good thing. We did a massive amount on export controls, making it much harder for Americans to export high tech to China. And now you're seeing every day there are new executive orders coming out that are essentially designed to build a moat around American technology. And what I meant when I said we should be more offensive is, again, not to be more aggressive, but instead of just trying to tear the Chinese down, to build ourselves up. What we really need to do is make sure that we remain the #1 innovation superpower in the world. And we're there. But boy, I say this sometimes to my Stanford class, when you look at China and tech, it's like looking in the rearview mirror and saying things in the mirror are closer than they appear. Right? So, Huawei is great at 5G. The technology is excellent. It's also enormously subsidized. Semiconductors, they're still behind, but boy, they're putting hundreds of billions of dollars into catching up. So in each of these areas, we need to look hard at what can we do? And by we, I mean the United States and other like-minded technology superpowers. And that can be, depending on the tech you're talking about, Germany, the UK, Israel, if you're talking AI, or India, semiconductors, obviously Taiwan and South Korea and Japan. What can we do together to make sure we collectively stay in the lead?
Very insightful. I want to seize upon that semiconductors thread for a second. They're a really tricky piece of the puzzle, as I know you're aware. The income our companies generate from the sales of chips to China funds a lot of the R&D, which has allowed us to stay at the cutting edge here.
Yep.
But by equipping China with our chips, we're providing them with the tech they need to compete with us in other industries. So is there a good way to kind of solve this natural tension? Because from my vantage point, I know we can't just say, okay, no more chips, because when we say no more chips, one, we're denying that very important revenue stream from US companies. Two, we're also creating incentive for China to put more money into standing up its own domestic semiconductor industry, which I think it's going to do anyways, but that will certainly accelerate that process.
That's right. That is a perfect description of the paradox. I think you put it exactly right. This is it, and this is what our semiconductor companies have said to the US government, because what we're trying to do is say no more chips designed or manufactured. Most aren't manufactured here, but a lot of the most advanced are designed here, will be sold to China. Disaster, right? You put half our semiconductor companies out of business. So what are they doing? They're finding lots of loopholes, right? At first, it was the de minimis exception, where you actually moved more offshore, because then there was de minimis American content, and then you could send it to China. Ultimately, this is unsustainable. And you need a package that's both carrots and sticks for the industry. It's a really hard industry. It has huge ups and downs, very lean years where there's almost no profits. People are losing money. Then, and I think if there's any industry where you need an industrial policy, that bad name that nobody wants to hear, this is it. And so what are people contemplating? There's something out there in the Hill called the CHIPS Act that has bipartisan support, including from Mark Warner, Senator Cornyn, and others, that would put huge subsidies into the industry. That's one way to do it. Maybe that's not the only way to do it, but what you certainly need is, if I were in the Biden administration now, I would probably pretty quickly convene a group of senior government officials and CEOs of the major semiconductor companies. And this means also TSMC in Taiwan, Samsung in Korea, Toshiba and others in Japan, the Netherlands, which builds a lot of the equipment that then is used to make semiconductors. So get these folks in a room and say, what are we going to collectively do? Because once again, this is a problem that isn't going to be solved by the US alone. No matter how many subsidies we give, you're going to need a lot of the other players at the table. So it's really thorny. And there are some ideas for doing it. I think none of them are perfect, but you have set out the problem just perfectly.
And you mentioned this is something you would hope the Biden administration would do. Is it something you expect the Biden administration to do? And if or if not, what are some things in this realm that we might see come out of the Biden team in the weeks, months, and years ahead?
Yeah. Well asked. I don't have any insight into whether they're specifically going to do this. I know I have written about it. A lot of other folks who are well respected by them have written similarly about, do you have a tech alliance, and is it just semiconductors? Where else does it go? So the ideas are floating out there, and I know that the senior Biden folks are aware of them. The problem is always when you're coming into a new administration, the inbox is infinite. Everything is an emergency. And so my best guess, and it's really only a guess, is that right now they're just trying to get their team in place, right? And when you walk in there on day one, especially in the White House, you've got no files, there are no pictures on the walls, right? Sometimes your staff doesn't have their clearance yet. You're just sort of starting from scratch. So it's a little bit of sort of, finding where the file cabinet is and how to make yourself a cup of coffee, and then moving really quickly on things like, I would guess, the Iran nuclear deal will be front and center.
Okay.
A new China strategy writ large will be front and center. And then this tech and innovation stuff that you and I were just talking about, standing ourselves up, they're thinking about it. Like Jake just created a new position that's a senior director. He put a very smart young guy in there who's certainly going to be trying to push this. But this is something our government has never done. We don't coordinate tech and innovation policy very effectively across the administration. So we're doing something completely new. And that's always hard. There are so many antibodies in our system of government to doing new, complicated, big things. And I'll just say one more sentence on that. They've also done another great thing, which is if you're really steeped in the nerdy details of this, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which sits within the White House, OSTP, has traditionally been a little underpowered. Wonderful people, amazing scientists in there. They just nominated Eric Lander, who's an amazing biologist, bioethicist, perfect for this time of COVID. And they've made it a cabinet level post, which is hopefully that'll give it more oomph. But this is going to be hard, and there's a long list of to-do items before you get to this one. So I hope they do.
Certainly. And I think one of those items will be kind of deciding how to approach the Indo-Pacific. So I'm going to use this opportunity to touch upon that as well, because I know that India is something else you pay attention to. You look closely at that U.S.-India China nexus. So yep. I'd be kind of curious what role you expect India to play in the Biden administration strategy towards China and the Indo-Pacific writ large. And if you have any insight on it, I'd be kind of curious to also hear what role they might play in this tech piece of it as well.
Yeah. So India has really come a long way in their view of China. Back when I was in the State Department, now over 10 years ago, we would sort of broach the subject of, should we jointly help manage China's responsible rise? And the Indians were hesitant because, they have a huge, very long, ill-defined border with China across the high Himalayas. Back then, it was just ill-defined. Now it's actively contested. Mm-hmm. The Indians have become very worried, especially if you talk to those on the military side. You know, the incursions this summer were outrageous, right? Indians lost their lives, Chinese lost their lives, but the Chinese aren't admitting to it. It's much worse than the standoff you had in Docklam 3 years ago, which was resolved through diplomacy. This
Right.
still isn't resolved. In addition, Chinese submarines increasingly are active in the Indian Ocean and around Sri Lanka. There is the string of pearls, all these new ports that through Belt and Road Initiative the Chinese are building, and all of that makes the Indians deeply uncomfortable. And so where India used to say publicly, you'd have these summits between the Indians and Chinese, and they'd say, we were all victims of colonialism, repressed by the West. We share this great ancient civilizations and Buddhism and Hinduism. And then you'd say, well, but we actually don't have much in common. Now you don't even hear that rhetoric anymore. It's pretty tough. And so what's the outcome? India has moved closer and closer towards the West. So there's this organization called the Quad, that when I was in government, we thought it was too assertive and didn't want to do it. And so did the Indians, that India, the United States, Australia, and Japan do military exercises together. Now they're doing it all the time. It's just really common. And they've recently upgraded the dialogue so where they now also, the foreign ministers of those 4 countries meet. They're now talking, I saw something in the paper today about, do you have a tech component of this? And the Australians are sort of reaching out, and some Indians have reached out to me and others and saying, oh, how do we do this? So people are thinking that way, but I don't think there's any meat on the bones yet of that policy. It's so far just the germ of an idea, but I hope it comes to fruition.
And do you think it will come to fruition under a Biden administration? Do you think that this is something that they'll continue to pursue, the growth of the Quad and the further inclusion of India and U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy?
I do. The folks going in know India well and are friends of India. The forces I've just described are pushing us closer together. However, and there's always a but, I love India. I'm a huge Indophile, but it's a complicated group of folks to get agreements with. So we always say, well, let's start by having a free trade agreement. And then you go and negotiate it, and it's just a complete nightmare. And so it's just really hard to get concrete there. So I don't think India will ever be or soon in the next 5 years or so, a treaty ally of the United States. But will the partnership get closer and closer together? Will our militaries become what in military speak is called more interoperable? Like, will we do more together? Will we buy more stuff from each other? Has, India can now get some of our most advanced weapon system in the way they couldn't do before. I think all of that is going to continue, but you're not going to see a new NATO of Asia that includes India, for example. So baby steps, but steps in the right direction. Oh, one more thing. Sorry.
Yes, please.
There is this lurking in the background here, of course, is that Prime Minister Modi has done a lot to make India's economy more competitive, but it comes with this dark side of the far right wing of the BJP, incursions into what's happened in Kashmir with the social media shutdown and the huge crackdown, actively inciting anti-Muslim sentiment. And I think where the Trump administration was sort of willing to give that a pass or not talk about it, I think the Biden administration will have it much more front and center. So that's going to be a thorn in the side of the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very interesting piece and a very important piece for us. I will say I'm not an India expert, but as a casual observer, Modi's been a very important piece in kind of taking India from this non-alignment stance to one that's more closely aligned, though not fully, with the U.S. position on China. And the Trump administration, as you said, gave him the room to kind of do that freely, and we welcomed it. So certainly it'll be interesting to see how a Biden team handles the human rights issues, which, it's tough for the United States to take a stance on human rights against, country A, but not country B. So if we're going to do it, we have to do it uniformly. And I know that's something they plan to do. So we'll see how that plays out. Thank you for that insight. In what many have described as an unprecedented move, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Kelly Craft, met with Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, last Wednesday, virtually. For those who aren't avid China watchers, why was this move significant, and how might it factor into President-elect Biden's ability to negotiate or collaborate with China?
Yeah, absolutely. It was an interesting move, and there's most of your viewers will know this, but I'll just back up.
Yep.
The complication with Taiwan is that, of course, in the 1970s, when there was the opening to the People's Republic of China, Beijing, we created a diplomatic fiction, which says there's only one China, but we don't say which one it is, Taiwan or the PRC. The US and basically all of the rest of the world has their diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, Beijing, mainland China.
Right.
Almost no one has formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, to the point where it's sort of odd. Like there's sort of a desk in the State Department that watches Taiwan but doesn't say it, right? And we've always been very careful to not offend the Chinese on that front. With the recent aggression, especially in Hong Kong, Taiwan, which was moving closer and closer to China because the business ties are just so extreme and so profitable for both sides, has said, are you kidding me? This could be us. And so they re-elected last January in a landslide Tsai Ing-wen, who's done, I think, in my view, a very good job walking that very dangerous tightrope, because if she says Taiwan is an independent country, she might have a war on her hands, but she doesn't want to bend to the will of China. And frankly, you know, most Taiwanese citizens are just fed up. They have a very negative view of mainland China in the way that they maybe didn't a few years ago. So this is a really dangerous situation. And the Trump administration has pushed and pushed and pushed and sent senior American diplomats there, not like Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, but, you know, Kelly Craft, the ambassador to the UN, and just sort of needle the mainland Chinese, saying, look, if you do this, we can do that. I think that will tone down a little bit. But based on working groups that I've been involved in with some of the folks who are going in and others, Taiwan is front and center in people's thinking. American strategists are quite worried about what China will do. Will there be a frontal military assault on Taiwan? Most people think probably not. Will there be something like economic strangulation or a blockade or something short of that, that kind of tries to bring Taiwan to heel? Maybe. And if that's the case, what does the US do about it? All of those questions are unclear. And I would bet that Kurt and Laura and all the good folks who are about to go into the NSC to think about this stuff are going to spend a lot of their time on it. But no.
I strongly suspect you're right. I think Taiwan will continue to be a vexing question for the United States. And thank you for your insight on that.
Just one more word on Taiwan that ties it together with the conversation we were having about semiconductors earlier.
Yes.
The most advanced chips on earth are produced by TSMC, Taiwan's semiconductor, as you know. And those fabs, which is what semiconductor factories are called, are basically all along the west coast of Taiwan facing the mainland. So when you think of the casus belli, you know, you can have all sorts of, I'm not saying that this will happen, but, you know, if you think America cut off Japan's access to oil in the 1930s and early 40s, that ultimately precipitated Pearl Harbor. There are some people, and I don't think I'm one of them, but saying, wow, cutting off the supply of TSMC chips to China, is that a similar thing that's going to force China's hand in this? So we're in a whole new world where oil isn't the currency as much as computer chips are.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point and certainly a very relevant one. And I know the United States is doing, I think, a lot of thinking about how we reshore some of those chip foundries or fabs to ensure that we have capacity here should the worst case ever happen. But I think
Right.
to date, my understanding is most of that's talk. I'm not sure there's anything too exciting that's going on that front too.
Yeah, TSMC have said they're going to build their next fab in Arizona, which is great. From the people who know this better than I do, I hear that it's not their most advanced chips, which is obviously not so great. Plus, these things take years and years to build, so it's not that immediate.
And certainly, if I was TSMC, I'd probably want to keep my most advanced on the island in Taiwan, right? So, H.R. McMaster published an opinion piece in the Washington Post yesterday. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see it, but he argued that President-elect Biden would be doing the world a favor if he kept in place many of the Trump administration's China policies. Looking beyond tone and rhetoric, do you expect that Biden will keep many of these policies in place, or do you think that his China policy will differ greatly from that of President Trump's?
Okay, so I don't want to speculate. I can't speculate because I don't know what they'll do. I think what I would do if I were making the decisions is do the kind of small reach out and open hand things that we talked about. Fulbright program, readmit each other's journalists, reopen the consulates and roll those back because they're easy and they just take a lot of the pressure out of the situation. Re-enter the WTO, re-enter the Paris Agreement, all the things we're already talking about. Then you've got the slightly harder one, which is what do you do with visa policy, where there actually is a problem with some Chinese researchers and students being pushed to spy on behalf of Beijing. I think the FBI has overreached, and the United States basic research system and our university system is world-class because we allow the best minds from the world in. So we shouldn't just shut it all down. But you there probably think about it for a few months, have a smart commission that thinks about how to tailor that more narrowly. So I think that Bush administration policy, if it were me, I would moderate, not roll back entirely. And similar on the executive orders, you know, they're coming in fast and hot. Every day there's a new one, right? It's, you know, TikTok and WeChat ban, and these people can't be listed, and these people are part of the PLA, and it's too much to make sense of.
Right.
I have a feeling when the dust settles, a lot of those will be found actually illegal in the United States under U.S. law. Like the courts have already basically struck down the TikTok and WeChat ban. It's just not how we do business. So those kind of one-offs that are discriminating against specific Chinese companies, they'll disappear. Others, you need to, again, think very carefully about and maybe tailor them more narrowly, but then make them actually enforceable. And what do I mean by that? There's, for example, an executive order on secure communications, which deals with Huawei and everything related to 5G. Important. We should keep that going. But right now it's not very enforceable. It's really broad. So that takes a lot of work. And this gets back to what we were talking about, coordinating the interagency. Sometimes what happened in the Trump administration is like Trump and Peter Navarro, or whoever was next to him, maybe it was Matt Pottinger, they would just write him and put him out there with no consultation. And Commerce is saying, wait a second, we have the Bureau of Industry and Security, and we should be weighing in here. There was no process for this kind of stuff. And so now I think you will see a process which will slow it down, and you'll not roll it back entirely, but you'll rationalize it.
Great.
I'm not sure how that fits with what HR said, since I haven't read his piece.
Well, it's worth reading, and I think there certainly, I think you two are more in agreement than disagreement. So before I turn over to the audience, I have a final question for you, as well as a question for the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and have us launch a poll. Audience members should see that. It's, are you feeling optimistic about the future of U.S.-China relations? Hopefully you're feeling cautiously optimistic like Anja is. And Anja, while the audience is answering that question, what is one piece of advice you'd give to the incoming administration as it looks to deal with China? And just again, for the audience, we're going to go to your questions soon. So if you haven't already submitted your questions, go ahead and start doing so now.
Yep, I already have. Oh, do you have an echo?
Perhaps let me go and mute myself.
Seems to be better. I think I've already kind of given my recommendations in our conversation over the past half hour, but I would probably tell them what they already know and are doing. Lower the temperature, find a few areas where you can actually agree, but by and large, make sure that the US builds back better, which is the mantra of the Biden transition, and that we are strong and dynamic and our economy is humming again and we're educating our people, because that's the best thing we can do in order to compete with China.
Wonderful, well put, and a nice optimistic note to end on. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and look at the poll. So we are seeing that 44% of the audience is feeling optimistic, 56% is not. I suspect they might fall into that nervous camp where I find myself.
Yep, me too.
I guess they're not mutually exclusive.
In the sense that people will try, but
yeah,
not so optimistic that it'll work. Yeah.
Very fair. Great. So we're going to go ahead and turn over to questions from the audience. So our first question comes from David Rosenblum. It appears that there is increasingly hostile reaction in Europe and Asia to China's behavior. Is that meaningful? And if so, is it affecting Xi's position internally? And how so?
Yeah, such a great question. Thank you. It is absolutely meaningful, and I don't think it's impacting him internally yet. So let me say a little more. After COVID came out, China infamously started this, they were sending PPE everywhere and trying to help people, but then at the same time sort of bullying individual countries that weren't saying what China wanted. Most famously, Australia is calling for an investigation into the origin of the virus. And, you know, China has acted abominably, right? Full on retaliation in terms of trade and other, and it turns out that, you know, all these countries talk to each other. So where the Europeans were very sanguine about China until recently, now there is a little proliferation of working groups. What can the US and Europe do together about China? What can the US and India do together about China? What can, right? So finally we are coordinating. Now, that's not to say that it's reached everyone. Europe, for example, just signed an investment treaty with China, which, you know, I think the Biden administration would have liked to be consulted on, but they weren't. But public opinion, or elite, like government folks' opinion in Europe has swung heavily against China in the past 12 months. It's been pretty impressive, frankly. So that's all, I think, good. Does that harm Xi Jinping internally? I think, look, the Chinese Communist Party, even people like me, my friends at Stanford, elsewhere, who study this really closely, it is a black box. No one's going to be able to tell you what's really going on in there. And what I say to my students sometimes is an authoritarian regime is like, it's rigid, like a glass, and you can tap it 100 times and nothing happens. Tap it just the right way and it splinters. So far, Xi seems to have a pretty solid grasp on power. Is he really going to be in there for life? Maybe not. You know, he certainly doesn't consult with people. He doesn't let his inner circle out to talk to any foreigners. You know, all track 2 dialogues and things are basically off. So there could be some stirrings eventually, but I would guess not maybe in the next year or so.
Would you attribute that shift in attitudes to COVID-19, or was this something that's a pre-existing trend?
Pre-existing trend, and COVID-19 accelerated it. And the wolf warrior diplomacy, the sort of, you know, Chinese ambassadors berating the Swedes and the Australians, you know, finally annoyed people.
Yeah,
as it should.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And if I add my own speculation to it as well, I'd say that you know, if I was Xi Jinping and many of his supporters, I'd be saying, you know, well, much of the anger that we're seeing abroad is a result of COVID-19, which we had no control over. Which, I mean, at least that's the line in parts, and perhaps they feel, the victims of a narrative that that they think has been weaponized against them, right, by the United States and its allies. So,
Right.
I certainly think internally he's probably doing just fine on that front. But like you said, for now, we'll see how it continues. And I know that the Belt and Road is something that internally is also creating a bit of strife for him. So I'll move on to the next question. This is from Carl Breyer. My impression is that there is a strong consensus here in the US that we're in a sort of Cold War with China. However, oh, sorry, I lost the question. However, give me a second. Sorry about that.
I see it. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Great. I'll go ahead and keep reading. However, while Trump was able to confront China, his administration was unable to articulate broader policy change in a way that presidents did at the beginning of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Do you think the Biden administration can develop a better articulated policy that will be the platform for long-term China policy through Biden's closer ties to the foreign policy community?
Boy, I hope so. I think and I'm not sure President Trump ever called it a Cold War, but certainly the people who worked for him did. And they characterized it as an ideological struggle, to the point of when you saw all those speeches, from Pottinger to Pompeo to the head of the FBI to others, one after another, they came out and had to give this big anti-China speech that really stopped just short of calling for the fall of the Communist Party of China. I think that's counterproductive. And I think a Cold War is a completely inapt analogy here. The Cold War happened because the Soviet Union was self-isolating. They didn't try to deal with the rest of the world. They didn't trade with anybody. It's a completely different system. China trades much more with far more people than we do. So it's just not going to work to isolate them. And the idea that you think that there's going to be a decoupling between the US and China in every sector broadly across the economy, I think that's also undesirable.
Yeah.
And that's very different from the more narrow tech decoupling in a certain few areas that are that implicate our national security, like we talked about before. I think that will move forward. But the broad, are you really going to pull Starbucks out of China, and what does that achieve? I think it doesn't achieve very much. Ultimately, we're going to have to find a way, these two great superpowers, to jostle along, manage our differences, and find a few areas where we can actually continue to do business together in a positive way. And that might be climate change, although are the Chinese going to be willing to do much more than they already committed to in 2014? Unclear. It might be eventually North Korea. There are areas where we used to work constructively with China where we're not now. And I hope that some of those can come out again, and that this is not a Cold War, because that doesn't help anyone and diverts too many resources, both ours and the Chinese, away from building a better life for our own people. That's why I think it's in no one's interest.
Absolutely. And I think too, looking past our countries, it's bad for the rest of the world as well. Certainly lots of countries have benefited from being kind of manufacturing base of the world. Standards of living have risen inside of China and outside of China as a result of their success. So it's certainly an interesting competition we have with them. And Scott, this is a question from Scott Chamberlain. You've already touched upon it in parts. So would you mind commenting on climate change? Is collaboration between the US and China so existentially necessary that it means we no longer have leverage on other subjects, such as human rights? And how do you characterize leadership in sustainable energy and solar tech between the two countries? I like the last part of that. I'm really curious to hear on the decoupling piece, whether or not that's something we're seeing separation in as well.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with that last part. And there used to be a lot of cooperation between the US and China on clean tech and solar and all of these things. My husband, frankly, had a company in the space. He was bringing American startups in the space over to China to scale, because China is spending twice as much each year on clean tech than the US is. However, that has really dissipated over the course of the last four years. Partly because of the Trump administration and the tariffs, et cetera, but also in large part because of Xi Jinping and all the problems you know about, right? No one can do business there because they'll steal the technology and then underbid you. Right? It's really hard to do business with SOEs because they were caught up in the anti-corruption crackdown, rightfully or not, and so no one could make decisions. So to the extent that there was budding cooperation on clean tech between the US and China, it has really dissipated. And I think it'll be hard to crank that up again very quickly. You know, I hope we can eventually get there, but right now it's pretty dark. I also like the way the question was asked is, if we want them to cooperate on China, on climate change, does that reduce our leverage in other areas? I think it does. And here, I think you got to watch a little bit the interplay between John Kerry, who of course used to be Secretary of State, now has the big climate change czar job. Czars are complicated in the US government because it's an unusual new structure. No one quite knows who reports to whom.
Right.
And I'm
the
sure
lines
Secretary
of authority
Kerry,
are quite unclear, right?
they are. And, you know, Secretary Kerry is wonderful and he'll do a great job on this, but will he inadvertently say something that, you know, the rest of the administration wasn't quite ready to say? So I think you're right to worry about that piece. By cooperating on climate change, will we inadvertently lose leverage on other things?
Perfect. And I'm going to go ahead and jump to a question from Kimberly Marteau Emerson, who, in part because you just mentioned this human rights piece and the leverage you might lose there, and I'm glad to see that you know her. We're big fans of Kimberly ourselves. So she says, I read this morning that the US is calling China's treatment of the Uyghur population a genocide. Will this stick in the Biden administration? And if so, how will this impact the Biden administration's approach to China? And again, I think you've already partially touched upon this, but I know Kim is eager to get an answer here, and as am I.
Kim, so nice to be in touch via text here on the Zoom. She's a great watcher of China relations and our relations with Europe and Germany, obviously. You know, and the honest answer is, I don't know. Labeling something a genocide has a lot of legal consequences for what you can just then do with the country. So I think it's one more thing that the incoming Biden administration is going to scramble to sort out. It would be really hard from a public relations perspective to say, no, it's not a genocide, right? Because it is, whether it's a genocide or not, it's beyond the pale. It's outrageous what's happening there. But do you want to go that far? And you know, I just have to say something about this transition. In every normal transition, the outgoing administration does everything possible to not lock in their successors, right? Even from Bush to Obama, there was a lot of conversation. They're like, hey, we were thinking about doing this, but we won't do it and we'll let you do it. You know, just let the person who's getting the baton take over. What you're seeing right now on China policy is the opposite of that. And it's going to make for a really complicated few months as, you know, the Biden gang sorts this all out.
Yeah, absolutely. I've certainly seen lots of commentary on that. I will say I've read one interesting kind of possible silver lining that came from one of our own members, which is that a lot of this will be helpful leverage for the Biden administration team, and that they can kind of give away some of these kind of final moves from the Trump administration in order to shore up their relationship with China. However, politically here in the United States, that may be something that's difficult for them to kind of accept, because it will open them up for, you know, to criticism on being weak on China. So I'm very curious to see how ultimately this plays out.
That's right.
Moving to a question from DJ Peterson. What should Biden do with the Trump-China tariffs? A short question, but certainly a very complicated one.
I can imagine there's some junior staffer right now going in who's going to be spending the next 4 weeks on what should we do about each of these China tariffs, because of course it's so thorny, right? And again, if it were me giving the advice, I would look first at the tariffs on agricultural products, because it is really hurting our heartland. I mean, it's hurting our farmers in California. I talked to a lot of groups in the middle of the country, farmers, cooperatives, steel workers, steel manufacturers. People are suffering. And especially on the ag side, so much of those, they're fungible, right? If you don't buy the soybeans from America, you're going to buy them from Brazil. And it just feels like we shot ourselves in the foot. So those are the first ones I would think about rolling back. Is there more than, do you hold the line at some of the other ones and say, okay, we're going to actually start the phase 2 negotiations and we're going to see if we can get to real market access, real IP protections, all of the things that frankly, the Trump administration was close on a year and a half ago until the rug got pulled out from under them by, you know, the highest level, the standing committee of the Chinese Communist Party. Maybe you can roll back the clock and go back there. I'm skeptical. I think it'll be really hard.
Great. This question comes from Rob Begland. One of the effects of the COVID pandemic originating in China was that it caused people to wonder whether we should consider the effect of authoritarianism differently than we have in the past. Does growing interdependence force a larger conversation about transparency and openness in China for the benefit of foreign nations and populations? And will COVID be a productive place for that conversation, or did the Trump administration's approach jeopardize progress there?
I do think the Trump administration's approach jeopardized progress, but Xi Jinping's approach did more to jeopardize progress. You know, they were going to hide the origins of the virus. And I think as aggressive as the Trump administration was in blaming it on China and calling it the Wuhan virus, I think that was inappropriate and undiplomatic. But, you know, China has a lot to answer for. I don't believe that, let me be clear, I don't believe the conspiracy theories that any of this was intentional or it escaped from a Wuhan lab. And I think those have pretty much been debunked. But if you were open and transparent, you would have had a WHO team in there right away saying, okay, the whole world is going to look at the origins of this. We're going to work on this together. They're still stalling. These guys still can't get visas to go in. And that's on China. That's really outrageous. And so, yeah, we can talk about transparency, but the Chinese aren't being transparent at all.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think many of our membership would as well. This question comes from Chris Lawson. How do you feel the larger Chinese society feels about their government when otherwise admired VIPs in China, like actress Fan Bingbing or the founder of Alibaba, seem to be publicly strong-armed and forced to capitulate to government pressure?
Very good question. You know, they're not hearing this the way we are. And Xi Jinping continues to be legitimately popular in China. Increasingly, the media space there is so closed that people are nationalistic pro Xi Jinping and pro China and have bought hook, line, and sinker the view that America is trying to keep them down. This is like the unequal treaties. We're trying to push China back. It's unfair. So, you know, you can go around all day long about who's to blame, is it Trump or Xi?
Yeah.
It is the fact that that's happening. I'll just give you one example for how closed the space is for open discussion. I used to go to China 4 or 5 times a year. I haven't been, I mean, no one's been anywhere, but I haven't been since December of 2019. Almost every track 2 dialogue that I was a part of has been shut down, not because of COVID, but because the Chinese won't give some of the Americans visas because they don't like what the Americans have said about them publicly. When I was last in China, I have a lot of Chinese friends, some close enough where I would normally go to their house for tea. Not one, but 2 of them said, "We're so happy you're in town. Let's take a walk and please don't bring your cell phone," because it's actually unsafe for them to have American friends, especially some who formerly worked in the government or are academics. So the space for conversation is closing really rapidly. And maybe eventually, this goes back to how rigid it is. It's getting more and more rigid. Maybe that means it eventually explodes. But right now, when you look at opinion polls from in China, most of them are buying the Chinese Communist Party line.
Right, absolutely. And I think too, to kind of build upon the insight you provided to Chris, many people in China, like you said, they're not seeing the full narrative. They're not seeing the kind of full truth of the matter when it comes to somebody like Jack Ma. Instead, the focus is on reading between the lines, or putting past comments under the microscope and really making them look like the bad guys, and they don't support the party 100%. And that kind of purity test is something that's really important to some of these Chinese nationalists. And it becomes a really easy point for the Communist Party to kind of take advantage of and tear down their credibility publicly in the eyes of the Chinese writ large.
That's right. And also, in China, there's been a parallel reaction to huge tech that there is here. People aren't feeling all that sorry for Mark Zuckerberg right? When antitrust enforcers are coming after him. So there's a little bit of that in China too, which is, well, maybe Alibaba did get too big for its britches, and people just don't want to speak out.
Right. And I suspect some of the same sentiments that we see here around comments around, look at the Amazon workers. Jeff Bezos is so wealthy, he could certainly afford to pay them more. Those same narratives exist abroad as well, and certainly in China, a country that, on paper certainly holds up a more egalitarian society.
That's right.
This question comes from Ira Kassoff. What does China's Hong Kong policy mean for Taiwan and prospects for reunification?
Hi, Ira. So nice to see you on this. Ira is a great China expert himself, so he
certainly is.
And I think we've already discussed it a little bit. I think it makes reunification, peaceful reunification, totally unlikely. As we already talked about, Tsai Ing-wen reelected in a landslide. Most Taiwanese I speak to are now much more anti-mainland China than they were before. What does it do about forcible reunification? I think probably nothing yet, but there are all sorts of scenarios that are dangerous and complicated, short of all-out war or forcible reunification that we've already talked about.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from Greg. Greg, I don't know if your last name is pronounced Giovanni or not, but if it isn't, I apologize. Greg's question is, on a fairly regular basis, we hear about business failure and credit defaults in China. Can you describe the overall credit quality and credit issues facing the country?
Yeah, I wish I could, but it's so opaque. So I think the fundamental thing to understand about credit in China is that ultimately everything is owned by the government. So there's a lot more you can do for each piece of the system to bail each other out. A few years ago, there was all this conversation about state and local entities and state and local owned enterprises, SOEs, going out of business and having all this huge bad debt. True, but that's different from big household debts like we have in the United States. And what can happen is ultimately, you issue some bonds here and there, and everybody sort of works it out in a Chinese way. So yes, huge credit problems, but the idea that you're going to have a 2008, 2000 style Western type default, I think is unlikely. I know we're out of time, but Carol Hamilton had this great question.
I'm very glad. I think this is probably a short answer, unfortunately, on this one, but.
Yeah. Will there be change in U.S. support for human rights in Tibet? Look, I think it's completely bipartisan. Everybody supports Tibet and human rights there. You'll see more, I think, loud commentary from the Biden administration about human rights. The sanctions that the Trump administration put in place that are enshrined in acts of Congress are actually quite strong, even though the president himself didn't always say what he should have said.
Yeah.
But so I think you'll see a continuation of that tough policy, but probably not more.
I think that's very fair. Well, Anja, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. I've had a lot of fun. I hope you have as well. Really, thank you for sharing your insights with us. And thank you to our audience members for joining us today. I hope you'll consider joining us again tomorrow from 1 p.m. to 1:45 p.m. to hear our president and CEO's outlook on U.S. foreign policy under Biden. Anja, you're invited as well. And again on February 3rd from 12:30 to 1:30 Pacific, when we will host Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti to discuss the roles cities play in international relations. So with that, we're going to go ahead and adjourn today's call. Thank you again, Anja. This was really a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope our members did as well.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Great moderating, Alex. Bye.
Thank you very much. Take care, Anja. Bye.